Welcome to Reflections on Water. I'm Dave Ross.
And I'm Anna Wildeman. In this episode, we sit down with Tracy Mehan from the American Water Works Association. Dave, we had such a great conversation with Tracy, and we really covered a lot of ground. I mean, we talked about the lead and copper rule. We talked about PFAS. We talked about the emerging contaminants issue, and then a lot of talk about money, infrastructure money and affordability issues. And even though we covered so much ground, I feel like there's still so much more that we could have talked about with Tracy, including some of these big picture policy questions around the Safe Drinking Water Act framework and sort of the other regulatory tools that the federal government and the states have available to them.
Yeah, and I think people are really going to enjoy the conversation. Tracy provides some amazing perspective on the big ticket cutting edge issues in the Safe Drinking Water Act today. But I agree with you. I think we need to have Tracy back on to continue the conversation about, is the Safe Drinking Water Act the right tool to continue to grapple with some of these big ticket issues? I think it's an amazing tool. The question is as we go forward, can we continue to enhance it and make it even more adaptable to the emerging issues of the day? So more to come on that. But in the meantime, Anna, I think we should roll the tape because I think the folks are really going to enjoy this conversation.
I want to welcome to the podcast Tracy Mehan. Tracy is a pillar of our water community. I mean, quite literally, Tracy has had a long history in water policy at the highest level, including as a former assistant administrator of the Office of Water at EPA. Tracy currently serves as the executive director of government affairs at the American Water Works Association. We call it AWWA. Welcome to the show, Tracy.
Thank you very much.
It's great to see you. Can you tell us a little bit about AWWA and your role there?
Sure. The American Water Works Association is, we like to think, maybe the largest and hopefully effective water association in the world. It was started in 1881 in St. Louis at Washington University. It's a 501c3. So while we do advocacy, which is in my shop here in Washington, most of what we do standards. We're a certified standard setting body, both for wastewater as well as drinking water, education, programming, ongoing continuing education and training, policy development, et cetera, et cetera. And we have 50,000 individual members and 4,400 utility members, drinking water utilities, 60% of whom are combined systems, that is, they do water and wastewater, and about 2,000 or so what are called service providers, manufacturers, A&E firms, et cetera. And there's 8 of us here in Washington doing regulatory affairs and legislative affairs, and I run that office. It's called our Government Affairs Office here in Washington, D.C.
Wow, that's great. Sounds like a pretty significant footprint within the industry.
Hey, Tracy, this is it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining the Reflections on Water podcast. I wanted to touch base and start off the podcast talking a little bit about using that AWWA Washington, D.C. presence setup that you just talked about and talk about money. We had, with the infrastructure bill passing last year, there's a very significant infusion of cash into the water sector, water and wastewater sector, much needed, in my opinion. Why don't you just give us a little bit of background on what the infrastructure bill means for the water sector and maybe your AWWA's role in helping to secure that money?
Well, thanks, Dave. As you can imagine, AWWA, like the other water associations, we're all following this very carefully and very much behind a strong advocacy position, especially on some of the newer challenges like replacement of lead service lines, emerging contaminants such as PFAS, but also just boosting the baseline programs. That would be the state revolving loan funds and WIFIA. I would have to say it was really, it was a historic infusion of resources into the sector. And one doesn't want to be ungrateful, but it's a good step. I don't think it's and in fact I'm working on a cautionary column right now where despite these billions of dollars coming into the sector, the challenges are great. We put a $1 trillion number on just the drinking water needs over the next several decades, and the wastewater guys will come up with the same figure for them, and then there's stormwater and water supply. So ratepayers are still going to have a responsibility, and of course we want to avoid a moral hazard of looking for the federal money, therefore relieves the duty of local governments and municipalities and utilities to keep their rates in a robust way, dealing with affordability, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about. But no, this is a historic infusion of resources and cash. It will take a little while for the python to digest this huge a bit of food that's coming in, since 85% of the dollars are going to move through the state revolving loan funds, both the drinking water and the clean water fund. And there's part of the bill that requires a state match, some that doesn't, staffing issues. They do get resources allocated to them under some of the formulas. So, we're trying to be cooperative, educate our members, make sure that they all make their next best friend the state revolving fund folks in their jurisdiction. And we've always been supportive of increased funding for WIFIA. That was one of our brainchilds. We're glad to see that getting support, not just in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but in the latest appropriations bill. So it's very good, and it's all just part of the chipping away at what is a huge challenge, that is our infrastructure investment gap in the water and wastewater sector.
I love the fact that you mentioned, in your Python reference, but really how the money flows into the system and then out actually to the community level. A lot of that, and I think the public is probably lost or a bit in the dark as to how this happens, right? It's Congress appropriates money to the federal government then rolls it out to the states. Do you see implementation challenges, particularly at the state level? How long are we talking before real money starts flowing out into the communities?
Well, I think we'll see it next year, but it is a challenge. And as I say, I think people are going to have to be patient and not have expectations that are unrealistic. I was at a conference of the state administrators of the SRFs, and I sat with a couple of states that said, no, this is just like a plus up. We just keep doing what we're going to do. They didn't seem to be overly fazed by it. Now, these happen to be states that didn't have a lot of PFAS issues or lead service line issues. But, it's a big country. So you're going to see different situations, different circumstances in each state. There are challenges, and we tell our members, you've got to get in there, talk to this SRF folks, get on those intended use plans, and get in the queue and get to know the process. If a majority of utilities haven't accessed the SRFs before, so that's one of our major educational efforts within the association itself. There are some hiccups there. The standard formula for allocating dollars to the state through the SRF program is through a needs survey that EPA does periodically. The needs survey that's driving the initial tranche of money is the old one that does not account for lead service lines. And that's been in the field. It's out. I hear it's back from the field, but it's not going to get in till next year, as I understand it. I may be off on the timing. So there's going to be dollars probably misallocated in terms of lead service line dollars, which will then have to kind of lapse and then revert back and then go back out. But in the main, I think there's still going to be a lot of money moving, and people need to get proactive to make sure they can access it. Independent of the new money, I think now that the lead and copper rule, which I know you were intimately involved with, is final and in effect, I think you're going to see some bigger jurisdictions that have like tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of lead service lines looking at the WIFIA program too, not just SRFs, but that's speculation on my part.
I think it's sound, informed speculation. I think when we start seeing the price tags, and particularly knowing the success of the WIFIA program, it's nice to see the drinking water sector starting to pick up into the WIFIA space. Obviously, early on, I think the wastewater folks were jumping in on the WIFIA bandwagon early. Before we talked about affordability, you mentioned PFAS, you talked about lead and copper rule. We want to dive deeper in this podcast on all those topics in a moment, but I think I'm going to get to the appetite question back on your Python reference. The infusion of cash is historic. It's nice to see the federal government putting more resources in this space. Back in the day, 1970s, 1980s, the federal government was a huge funder of water, wastewater infrastructure, and it's nice to see the infusion now. Do you think Congress will continue to feed the needs of the water sector going forward, or do you think this is it's a one-time hit and then Congress will move on?
The key variable here is politics. And I say another variable is just the state of the federal fiscal situation. The debt is historic. I think one has to be cautious. I think there is enough support for SRF and WIFIA that the ongoing appropriations will continue. There might be, and this is just rank speculation on my part, but there might be just sort of enough sensitivity and awareness of the lead challenge that we might see a plus up on the 15 billion, given the fact that it's at least triple that the need. And it is a clear federal mandate that's driving the expenditures. Thought we were managing it pretty well through corrosion control and other things, which we don't want to pick at that scab, but we do have a new federal mandate, and it's going to drive lead service line replacement. So I think one's got to be cautious in predicting like a sort of an ongoing, continuous shower of federal dollars in this space. But it's amazing that we got this money right now, but they're in a spending mood, and we'll see how that continues and what the trade-offs are in the inevitable political process.
Tracy, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about affordability. EPA released an affordability guidance document, and AWWA had some opinions about it. Can you talk to us about the organization's views and kind of where you're coming from with it?
We are referring to the recent proposed a revision to the proposed guidance on financial capability, which is the sort of factored into negotiation of consent decrees for combined sewer overflows. The reason why we worry about this at AWWA, along with our sister associations like NAWA and WEF and others, is that obviously it's the same ratepayer. If you're in an area, well, you all from Wisconsin, the example I always like to use, Milwaukee MSD spent $4 billion on tanks and tunnels for CSOs. I mean, well spent. I'm not arguing. But then again, you've got a drinking water utility that doesn't have money to replace lead service. It's the same ratepayer is the point I'm making. And so Congress, as you know, had mandated a study by NAPA, the National Association of Public Administrators, who said, you got to change this. You got to get away from medium household income and look at the lowest quintile. You got to treat this as one ratepayer between the wastewater, the water, and the stormwater sectors. And other things, and you all, when you were in there, came up with a fairly decent proposal. We had hired a number of well-known experts in this field. That is the three associations I mentioned. And we thought we made a good faith effort. We tried to treat it honestly like a graduate seminar, discussing the ins and outs and the policy issues. And that didn't make it in the Federal Register. And now a new proposal is out that really kind of, I think, is a retrograde movement on the part of the agency. They put a cap on consent decrees for 25 years when we know time is money, and that there's already on the books 30-year, 35-year, maybe even a 40-year consent decree. They've kind of gone back to MHI and de-emphasized, at least in our estimation, the focus on the lowest quintile, the poorest of the poor. It's kind of a mess. And I'm going to generalize this. I think we also have a real good philosophic question here relating to environmental justice generally, as to what extent affordability is an element of environmental justice. Or another way to phrase it, do we treat economic justice just independently from environmental justice? Is there no interaction between the two philosophies or schools of thought? And we're kind of on the side that, hey, affordability is real. And while maybe our colleagues at regulatory agencies don't spend a lot of time at rate hearings, things like that, it has real world effects. And we're going to have a hard time, as I mentioned earlier, and this is an important point, rates are still going to be important. Customers are still going to bear most of the cost in the decades ahead. And this affordability thing is going to be a real hurdle to maintaining robust rates. Not that we can't argue about design and restructuring rates, but rates are going to go up, and this affordability issue is going to get worse and worse. And so we have to, I think, address it where we can. And the financial capability guidance was one place we could have.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the tension between affordability and environmental justice. In my experience at the agency, the regulators on the environmental side are a bit disconnected from the rate setting regulatory structure. And I think, quite frankly, some better education, some cross training in that space would probably be valuable for EPA. As an organization, as AWWA, like, how do you get the current administration to, which is clearly focused on environmental justice, right, to try to understand that affordability is an environmental justice issue? Like, what's your approach?
Well, you try to speak the truth and, and do it in as informed and articulate as a way as you can. Given the history of where we are, it's, I won't say it's a tough sell, but, it's a conflict of missions. It's confusing. It's outside a comfort zone in the traditional regulatory realm. And unfortunately, I think affordability is just not I think their view is, hey, Congress is taking care of the affordability process. Look at all these billions of dollars. Well, that's why at the beginning of this conversation, I said, look, this is great to get this infusion of cash, but the challenge is still there. There's ongoing O&M. I mean, we haven't even begun to experience the cost of PFAS, especially if it becomes a hazardous substance. We'll have treatment cost. We'll be moving to designer water just to meet higher standards. Will we have disposal? So this is going to be a monumental issue for the sector and for the long run of the environment and public health. And we need to be efficient and smart where we can. I realize the environment shouldn't be the cheapest deal in town. We need to be smart. And I thought the financial capability guidance relating to CSOs was a good opportunity for that.
So you mentioned PFAS. We've got to go there. I think, everyone's talking about it. Why don't you give us a little bit of perspective? Obviously, perfluorinated compounds, they're in the environment, they're in products, they're in the natural environment, they end up in our drinking water systems. But why don't you give us AWWA's perspective on perfluorinated compounds? And I want to talk a little bit about, the superfund liability question, because I think that's coming. But let's dive in on that, Tracy.
Obviously, it's a big issue. States have been out front of the federal government on this, and now we're kind of in a federal mode, which I know started under your watch. And we've never opposed regulation per se. We've just said stick to the process, the science-based, data-driven, systematic process within the Safe Drinking Water Act. There was, you remember, a year ago, efforts in Congress to kind of short circuit that whole process and just mandate regulation of the entire class of PFAS, which are gazillion. And we said, no, you might be able to group a few based on their, the toxic mode of action, et cetera. But so we were never against it. We just said, let EPA do its work without legislative intervention. And I know there was a little prod in some legislation from coming out of the Senate side, but we're working through it. We're doing we'll get into the notice and comment. We're paying for our own research, as we always do, trying to inform ourselves and our members and EPA. Hopefully, again, that spirit of mutual learning. And it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge because, the technology is granular activated carbon. That may work for a couple, but if they add 4, 5, 6, or whatever, you may be moving into RO, and all of a sudden, these costs are going to get pretty rough. I fear that PFAS in the long run will dwarf lead as a cost item, but that kind of depends also what happens, and this gets into your Superfund question. If it becomes designated or X number of PFAS compounds become a hazardous substance, well, then you've got disposal costs going up. You've got potential liability under the strict joint, several, and retroactive liability scheme of Superfund, given that the utilities would probably fall into the arranger category, disposal of residue or biosolids, et cetera. You already see this flaring up in states such as Maine. So at all the water associations, this is 100% consensus on this, wastewater, drinking water, rural water, is that there ought to be an exemption for water utilities, given the ubiquity of the compounds and given the honestly the innocence of utilities. I mean, we're just receivers of this stuff, and the cost consequences. And there was a letter where we had 10 associations just went out during Water Week to the Hill, and we'll see where it goes. But we definitely are concerned about the overall cost, but hopefully at the same time be smart and at least get us out from under the Superfund draconian liability net.
Yeah. So for our listeners out there, what the concern is in the water sector, Tracy used the phrase the receivers, right? So there's PFAS that will get into the water column, through other avenues, and then the drinking water plants and the wastewater plants, as part of their treatment, takes out PFAS, which is a good thing. But once you take out PFAS, you have to manage that PFAS as it transfers to another environmental media. And if there's a superfund liability listing, suddenly the water sector is potentially in the crosshairs of managing a hazardous waste and disposing of it. And who should bear the cost of that, I think, is a significant policy question. Sounds like you guys are working the hill on that. I assume you're probably also working the regulatory agencies, because there is a path, that the agencies are also regulated in this space.
Last year, we did have a discussion with OLEM, and we outlined a proposal we had where you could maybe structure a designation under RCRA that would limit liability under CERCLA. It was a polite conversation. They heard us out. We provided some analysis. I know they say they're trying to look at the Safe Drinking Water Act regulations with sensitivity, and one hopes the same is true with hazardous substance designations under CERCLA or Superfund or excuse me, RCRA or whatever.
Tracy, let's pivot a little bit. You mentioned the lead and copper rule a couple times. While Dave and I were leading the Office of Water, our team was able to promulgate revisions to the lead and copper rule, the first substantive revisions really after decades. When the Biden administration came in, they paused the implementation of those revisions to take another look at it, right? Eventually, they agreed to implement those revisions, but also committed to making further revisions to the lead and copper rule. Where is AWWA on the LCR revisions? And do you think there are going to be another set of revisions realistically? Because it was a real battle. Let's be honest. It's a battle to get that, any movement on that rule. It's a huge package. So what are your thoughts?
We support it. Well, we're always out in front for supporting the mandate to get on with inventories. That's just key. It's an information-based approach. It's fundamental to any kind of program to reduce the amount of lead service lines on private and public property. And, generally, our members want to do right by public health. We think we've had a lot of success over the decades under the old rule. I think 90% of all utilities were in compliance with the action or under the action levels through corrosion control. And as a nation, lead has been a great success. I mean, the people forget that we've had a 95% reduction in median blood lead levels in kids 1 to 5 since the 70s. And, I grew up in a house with lead service lines in South St. Louis. And so I've lived through that where we got it out of lead, we got it out of gasoline, we regulated as a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. We've had successful corrosion control implementation in drinking water utilities. So I think we're okay. We can handle this, and we want to go forward, and utilities are beginning to move. I do think there are going to be some more changes, that separation between the 15 and the 10 and the trigger level. I think that may get collapsed to 10. I mean, we're kind of assuming that. I think some of the issue of the first or the fifth sample, I think you're going to see changes, and we're kind of preparing our members that get on with the inventory, get that in place, but heads up, more is coming. So we'd be disserving our members if we thought that the rules is not going to be, tightened up a bit.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. I heard you talking about sort of the improvement that we've made over decades, right? And so when we're talking about, and Dave, you can provide a little more color on this, the 15 to 10, the trigger versus the limit, is your suggestion that the benefit of that incremental additional reduction may not be worth the extra cost, or that OIRA would really take a hard look at that if they were to go through the full interagency review process?
Well, I don't want to speculate, but again, the process is key. Do we do the analysis? Do we get it right? Benefit cost analyses is a technical and difficult thing to do, which is the problem the states have when they move out regulating, say, PFAS. They can sometimes get the technologies right, some of the science, but they're not very good at the benefit cost analysis, whereas OMB did have that expertise, as did EPA. I just think we got to do it and make sure we do it carefully. You can get into legitimate scientific and policy debates about how you do the benefit cost analysis, but it's just important that it be done and be transparent. If you followed alternate methodologies or you assume different discount rates, I mean, that's all part of the process, and usually That's all. And I expect a lot of that's going to happen. Again, I think where lead is more challenging is that historically, and again, over 40, 50 years now, whenever the research keeps showing at lower and lower levels, there's still harm and therefore more benefit when you reduce to those lower levels. So it's just the nature of the beast. And of course, in the case of lead service lines in old homes, there's also the disparate impacts to lower income people in poor neighborhoods, older neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. So as I say, if I had to flip a coin, I think we're going to see a tightening up of the regulation.
I agree with you. I think in the current administration, I think, if you look back historically in the lead service lines, for 8 years during the Obama administration, it was, that rule didn't move, partially because of the costs associated with it. Quite frankly, you mentioned OMB and OIRA, we had to go to war to try to get the lead, LCRR out on the street, trying to justify the cost benefit analysis. And there's no question that, the standard for how much lead can go into the body versus how do you actually regulate it under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's tension there, right? And so I think it'll be interesting. And I thought in the last year, while they paused the LCRR, I think they were trying to go for the money ball, the $100 billion to take care of all the lead service lines. $15 billion was a great amount of money, but more is needed. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how this administration grapples with the OIRA OMB process to try to justify kind of cost benefit analysis. Well, Tracy, I think we could go all day. We have so many other topics I'd love to talk to you about, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Your career in the water sector is unparalleled. Working for state, serving as the assistant administrator for water, what you do now for the drinking water sector. I have appreciated your guidance especially at my time at EPA and even, before and after. So thanks for all you do for the water sector. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me on this. It's a great forum to discuss issues of importance to us all, and I'm most grateful.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.